Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this lunchtime webinar about everything you need to know about EV charging. Before I get started, I'd just love to know if you can hear me okay. So if you can, just type a little message into the questions box. Great. All right. It looks like all the sound is okay. So I'll go ahead and get started. So first things first, let's just go over some logistics. Everyone is muted to avoid background noise, and we will have regular breaks for questions. And you can go ahead and send those questions to me via the questions box. So my name is Mal Skoran. I'm a program associate for Green Energy Consumers Alliance, which is a nonprofit organization based in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And our mission is to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. And the program that I work on mostly, Drive Green, helps us accomplish this mission by getting electric cars on the road in place of gasoline powered cars. You might already know this, but EVs charged in New England can cut emissions by about 75% per mile traveled. So the environmental reason to switch to an electric car is pretty compelling. And we see that's why a lot of people choose to do so. And since the electric grid is getting cleaner every year, the environmental benefits will only continue to grow. And that's because of some pretty incredible progressive energy policy in Massachusetts. But electric cars are a fairly new technology. And they're replacing gas-powered cars, which most consumers feel very comfortable using and owning and operating. So making the transition from gas to electric can be quite intimidating at first, even if you'd really like to do so. And charging an electric car is pretty different from how gasoline is pumped. So this webinar is meant to help clarify how easy charging is, and how you can integrate it into your lifestyle so that you feel ready to make the switch to an electric car, whether you're kind of in the shopping phase right now, or if you plan on switching to an electric car in the next couple of years. So in this webinar, we'll talk about how charging works and the way that the majority of EV drivers do their charging, which is at level 1 and level 2 speeds. And if you're not familiar with that terminology, we'll go over what that means in just a little bit. And then I'll be talking about both public and private charging options, as well as how to use the fastest charging option, which is called level 3 or DC fast charging. Finally, we will finish the webinar talking a little bit about how electric vehicles can have a positive impact on our electrical system, and I'll have a few comments about that. I do invite you again to ask questions throughout the webinar, especially for clarity on some of the points that I've made. But if you have a specific question about a topic that you see here that I haven't reached yet, just hold on to it until we get there so that I can potentially answer your question as I'm speaking in a later slide. So with that, we can get started. So electricity is not always the most intuitive thing to talk about. So knowing a few key terms can really help understand what's going on with charging. So let's all just get on the same page in terms of vocabulary. Don't worry, this is not a class in electrical engineering, but you are going to see these terms thrown around if you're going to start transitioning to an electric vehicle. So it's good to have a general sense of what they mean. And for me, it really helps to put all of these terms into something that you can visualize more easily, like water flowing through a pipe. The first thing is voltage. Voltage is what's called an electric potential, and that is determined by the power source, so wherever you're plugging in. Household outlets deliver about 120 volts AC power, but you can install higher voltage outlets to support appliances that need a lot more power. So in general, higher voltage means higher capacity for electrical flow. Current is the easiest to understand. It's basically the speed of flowing electrons through a wire, and it's exactly analogous to the speed of water flowing through a pipe. How much current flows out depends on how much power is required for whatever device you're using. So if you plug in something that doesn't need a lot of power, it will draw less current. If you need something that, if you're using something that requires more power, it'll draw more. And devices do that automatically based off of whatever power they need. And circuit breakers make sure that current is managed in a safe way so that it doesn't surge up and overload an electrical wire. And power is one that you're probably most familiar with, and it's one that we really care about when we're talking about EV charging. So power is the amount of energy delivered in a given amount of time. So that means if you have a higher power charging station, you have faster charging. And it really depends on voltage and current. So either increasing one of those two will increase the amount of power. And we'll see how that plays out in both level 1 and level 2 charging speeds. And then finally, I just want to draw a distinction between energy and power, since those two terms are often used interchangeably. But energy describes how much storage capacity is actually in the battery. So that's kilowatt hours, and that's what translates to the amount of miles that you can drive. And power is just energy over a given amount of time. So what does this all mean for an electric vehicle? Well, the two biggest questions that people ask me when they're talking about electric vehicles or learning about them for the first time is how far they can go and how fast they can charge. So the size of your battery will determine how much energy you can store in the car, and more energy means you're getting more miles out of that car. So that's one of the biggest factors that determines range. Efficiency describes how good the car is at converting energy into those miles driven. So bigger cars, which are heavier, are usually less efficient, but efficiency can also vary depending on road conditions, your driving style, and how fast you're driving at a particular moment. This is kind of a fun fact, but unlike gas-powered cars, EVs are actually more efficient at city driving speeds and stop-and-go traffic, whereas you'll see gas-powered cars excel at higher driving speeds and on highways. Then finally, weather is actually a pretty big factor into how far you can go on a single charge. And it's surprising how big of an impact ambient temperature can make. So now that we're past the winter and the weather is starting to get a little bit warmer, you'll actually see a lot of EV drivers having longer driving ranges than what their EPA estimated range for their vehicle states. So warmer weather means more driving miles. Cooler weather means some energy from the battery has to be used to keep it at the optimal operating temperature. And so that cuts into range quite a bit. And so all of those factors determine how far you can go. But the things that determine how fast you can charge are a little different. So charging is basically the process of transferring energy from the outlet or power source to the battery for storage. And so the power source is a major factor that limits how fast you can actually charge, because you can't draw more power than what is available from the source. And so the power source can be a charging station, it can be a household outlet, it can be another battery that you're drawing from, so anything that delivers energy. The other limiting factor that determines how fast you can charge is the vehicle's onboard charger, which you can see in the diagram there. So the terminology is a little confusing here because generally when people say charger, they mean the cable that attaches the car to the power source. But the onboard charger is something that's in the vehicle itself, and it is the device that before energy can be stored in the battery, the power has to be converted from AC power, which is what the outlet spits out, to DC power, which is what devices use. And so that's what that onboard charger does, is it makes that conversion so that energy can be stored in the correct form in the battery to be used by the vehicle. And I'll clarify exactly how that affects charging speeds in a little bit. So if you're a little kind of confused, don't worry, it is clarified once we talk about charging speeds. And then finally, weather affects charging speeds as well. So same kind of deal. In colder weather, charging can slow down. And in warmer weather, charging can go a little bit faster. So you'll see weather is the common denominator there. So let's talk about level 1 charging, which means just using a regular household outlet. All electric vehicles come with a cable that plugs the car into just a regular 120 volt outlet. It's like exactly like charging a smartphone. And you can see in the photo there, there are 2 available ports that can be used for level 1 charging. All electric cars have the J1772, which you can see pictured on the top. And then Tesla has its own proprietary charging port for all of its charging. So Tesla vehicles only have that second port that you see there. But there are adapters that will allow you to plug a Tesla car into a port that's meant for a J1772 car. The problem is household outlets don't really deliver a lot of power. You can get about 4 miles of range per hour of charging. And that can really vary between 2 and 6, again, depending on the weather. But 4 is a pretty good year-round average, and that's what I've noticed when I charge my electric vehicle as well. So I know what you're probably thinking. 4 miles of range and an hour of charging is extremely slow. But if you kind of look at it from another direction, if you're charging at that rate, it takes about 10 hours to recharge overnight if you drive about 40 miles a day, which is the average driving distance for most Americans. And people really underestimate how useful this can be. So for most commutes, if you're driving less than 40 miles in a day, this is plenty. And you don't really have to worry about installing a higher power or level 2 charger, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. So don't be discouraged by the fact that level 1 charging is really slow. We found that a lot of folks who have transitioned to electric vehicles through Drive Green end up mostly relying on level 1 because they don't do a ton of driving. And remember, you're not just sitting there with the car doing nothing the whole time it's charging. It takes just 5 seconds to plug in, and then you can go about your day or evening while the car does its thing. But many people drive more than 40 miles a day. And so level 2 charging is a way to try and make charging much faster and make driving an electric vehicle much more convenient and practical for those drivers who do travel longer distances. Level 2 charging uses the same ports as level 1, so the J1772, and then that unique port for Tesla. So if you are driving 250 miles in a day, you can recharge the entire car or overnight by plugging it into a level 2 station because it has a much faster rate of charging, up to 25 miles of range per hour. So there on the screen, as you can see, it's there's an up close photo of the charging station, and they're also known as EVSE, or electric vehicle supply equipment. But the charging station is essentially just a cable and box that connects your car to a 240 volt outlet, and it manages the electric current running between them. So you can see those 3 parts. You have a plug that would plug into a 240 volt outlet, which is something that is required if you're interested in installing a level 2 charging station at home. So it's a little bit different than a regular 3-pronged outlet that you might use to charge your computer, but they're fairly easy to install in garages, and many homes already have them in order to plug in high power appliances like washers or dryers. And then that middle part there, the silver part that says juice box, that's basically just a circuit breaker. So that box's job is just to manage current running between the car and your home to make sure it's at a safe speed for your home to avoid electrical overloading. And then finally, that white section on the right, that's what you would plug into your car. So again, it uses the same J1772 port that's in all electric cars. And then you can also buy charging stations that have the unique Tesla port as well. And I'll just mention the reason that these charging stations allow for much higher rates of charging is because they increase both the voltage with that specialized outlet and the current that's running through the cables. So 11 to 25 miles per hour of charging is a pretty big range if you're talking about, how long will it take to recharge an electric car fully. So how do you know what to expect for your car and how can you maximize that rate? So going back to the terminology I used before, it's actually the power of the onboard charger that determines your car's maximum charging speed at level 2. So here you can see a table of onboard charging capacity and then what that translates to in terms of miles of range per hour, and then also which cars fall under those umbrellas. So this is information that you can get from each car's spec sheet online, but I found that automakers tend to prefer advertising charging speeds in terms of total time to charge, which I think is not the best way to communicate charging speed. Most EV drivers plug in opportunistically, not necessarily draining their car all the way down to 0% before plugging in again. And so thinking about charging in terms of how many miles will you get per hour is a much more realistic way of thinking about how you're going to charge your car. And so notice all of the cars in the slowest charging bracket are plug-in hybrids. So they have significantly lower electric driving ranges, usually about 20 to 50 miles. So even though the charging rate is slower, it still doesn't actually take that long to get a full charge because the battery is smaller. And then you do see those higher onboard charger capacities for the all-electric vehicles. So you can expect to get what is shown there for any particular vehicle. So just as a little recap, even if a car can charge quickly, it can't draw more power than what the station can dole out. So if you plug a car in with a 7.2 kilowatt onboard charger into a 6.6 kilowatt station, it will only charge at 6.6 kilowatts. Whereas if you take that same car and plug it into a 10 kilowatt station, it'll charge at the max capacity of the car, which is 7.2 kilowatts. And in theory, automakers can improve this figure. We might see that number increase over time, but currently that adds a lot of weight and complexity to the car, which cuts into efficiency and therefore range. So automakers are really focused on trying to create a balance of a car that charges fast, but also, again, has that range and can go further on a single charge. So we may see this number tick up. It's possible that in 10 years, electric cars, the standard is 30 miles of range per hour of charging at level 2. But right now we see the number pretty stable. And it's pretty common across all of the new models coming out that that's a fairly common level 2 charging speed. And that's the end of the really technical stuff. So thank you for your questions. I can see some coming in, and I will see what we have here. So someone's asking for some clarification on whether a J1772 can work on a Tesla vehicle. So Tesla has that special port. It's proprietary. All of their fast charging stations, their superchargers as they're called, have that port. And so they only have the one single port. So if you do own a Tesla vehicle, or if you're thinking about getting one, you can always buy an adapter so that you can use public stations that have the J1772 plug. So it's basically like a similar concept to if you're plugging in an HDMI port into a Mac, you need a special adapter in order to fit that in there. And Tesla provides those. Someone also asked, 240 volts is the same as an oven, right? So I'm actually not sure, but it's possible that yes. I know that most people don't have a 240 volt outlet that they could use for EV charging that also would work for their oven in like a way that makes sense to, you know, park their car. Whereas many folks tend to have washers and dryers in or nearby garages. So it just makes it a little bit of an easier setup electrically. But yes, it's possible that the plug is the same depending on what type of oven you have. Someone's asking, does the electric vehicle supply equipment have to be indoors or can they be outside of your house? That's a great question. So most people will recommend that you install indoors if you have the option, just because it protects the charging station away from the elements, right? You don't have to worry about the impact of rain or snow on that charging station. But there are options to install a charging station outside of your house. They just tend to require a little bit more electrical work and therefore are more expensive. So if you do have the option to install indoors, then that's what you should go with. But if you don't have a garage, then there are options to go outside as well. Someone's asking, will the car continue to draw current if it is fully charged? Another great question. So the answer is no, the car will not continue to draw current if it's fully charged, not in a way that's extremely noticeable, at least. The one exception I can think of is, again, the Tesla vehicles, which that's because those cars are connected to the internet all the time and are constantly doing like software upgrades and updates and things like that, which do consume a good chunk of battery power. And so you might see more drawing of current with a fully charged vehicle if it's a Tesla, but in general, you won't continue to draw current if the car is charged. Someone's asking, is it possible to have an adapter that allows you to charge a non-Tesla at a Tesla fast charger? And unfortunately, the answer is no. Tesla does not provide things like that. And that is in part because they want to reserve their supercharging stations for Tesla vehicles. And then one last question before I move on. Someone is asking whether there is a memory effect if you keep recharging, even if you are not down to zero charge, which is a really great question. So for those of you who don't know, a problem with lithium-ion batteries that has been observed in a lot of devices, or not even lithium-ion batteries, but rechargeable batteries in general, is that if you don't deplete the battery all the way, it will actually start to mess with what the battery believes is its fullest capacity of charge, and so you get less capacity over time. That is not a problem with electric vehicles. In fact, with electric vehicles, you in general want to plug in as often as you can and really avoid draining your battery all the way down to 0% if you can. So there is no memory effect if you keep recharging. And the batteries are pretty self-sufficient in terms of their self-management and staying at a high capacity over a lot of time. And if you are interested in learning more about batteries, I do have a version of a webinar that talks about battery technology and the different benefits of lithium-ion versus other battery chemistries. So if you're interested in that, I can send that out after this webinar. But great question. I always love to see questions about lithium-ion batteries because we have them integrated all over our lives, but they can be difficult to understand. It's great to see that. The majority of EV drivers charge at home, either with the household outlet or at a level 2 charging station. And that's because it is incredibly easy to do so. It takes just 5 seconds to plug in, and you can completely eliminate the time they used to spend taking detours and refilling at gas stations. So a lot of people have found that it conveniently integrates into their lifestyle very well. If you do have an EV and you need some guidance about what kind of charger to buy and how to navigate the process of installing a charging station at home, then I encourage you to check out our electric vehicle charging at home guide to learn more about the nuts and bolts about that process. But if you already have a 240 volt outlet somewhere where it would be convenient to plug your car into, then pretty much all you have to do is buy the charging station and hire an electrician to plug it in and make sure that your home can handle the additional load. Otherwise, an electrician just has to install a 240 volt outlet wherever you're going to be charging, which is a standard job for any licensed electrician. And again, that process is a little bit more complicated if you are not able to install a charger indoors. If you're installing outdoors, you have to hardwire the charging station into your circuit box. But this guide will go through all of that with you and just help homeowners be a little bit more literate when it comes to figuring out how to do this electrical upgrade. But generally, including the labor and the electrician's time, as well as the actual charging station box itself, installation can cost around $1,200 on average. But we've seen costs as low as $600. And there's also a current federal tax incentive that helps homeowners decrease the cost of installing electric vehicle charging at home. So whether you already have an EV and you'd like to move forward and install a charging station, or if you're still thinking about it, I encourage you to look more into this guide because it'll be really helpful for some of those more technical details. And I also recommend our charging guide if you think you want to install a level 2 charging station at home, because there are hundreds of available charging units to choose from. And so the most basic and inexpensive models are just a plug and a circuit breaker. But there are lots of additional features that differentiate the lower cost models compared to the higher cost models. So the two kind of factors that I think are most important when thinking about what kind of station you want to buy are current and connectivity. So with current, you really want to buy something that matches the power of the onboard charger of your car. Don't blow your money on a super high power charger that won't actually charge your car faster. And with that, you can reference the table that I showed earlier and see what an appropriate current and power level would be good for your car. The second factor you might want to consider is connectivity. So do you want the ability to manage or monitor charging from your smartphone? Do you want to know how much electricity your car is using? Do you want to be able to schedule charging remotely from your smartphone if you know that you're going to be driving in the near future and want to have your car charged up? So if you're interested in those additional features, you do want to get a charging station that is Wi-Fi enabled and will let you do those things. And again, there are other factors to consider. So check out that charging guide for more information about that. So cost is another big question that I get. So once you actually install a charging station, or if you're just using a regular outlet, how much does it cost to use electricity that will be used to charge your car compared to gasoline? So we've seen that there are long-term savings and short-term savings by switching to electricity as your transportation fuel. And those long-term savings will actually help pay for the charging station if you choose to go that route. Electricity is much cheaper than gasoline, even in New England, which has higher electricity rates than other parts of the country. So when you do compare costs on an apples to apples basis, you save a lot of money. And when you start charging at home, your electricity bill will go up, but your gas costs will totally disappear. And the amount of money that you save really varies depending on the MPG of the car that you're driving now, and how often you drive. So if you'd like to check our math, we have a page on the Green Energy Consumers website where you can plug in your own mileage and see how much you would pay to charge at home. And one thing I want to mention, just because I'm sure we've all seen in the news the fluctuating oil prices that have led to lower gas prices recently. Electricity is not only cheaper than gasoline, but it's more stable in price. So we've seen that gas prices are fluctuating wildly because of the excess of oil in the global market, which means that if you're driving an EV, you can expect your fuel costs to be fairly predictable over the course of many years. So here on the screen, we have an e-gallon comparison. So comparing the regular cost of gasoline to electricity. That was from mid-November in 2019. But now we see gasoline is much, much cheaper. It's, in many places, it's down to $2 a gallon or less at this point. Especially in Massachusetts, that's what I've seen. But electricity has stayed fairly consistent. And so it's pretty easy to imagine a scenario where instead of having a surplus of oil, the global market has too little oil or demand is too high, and then you can see those prices triple or even quadruple over a certain amount of time. And so drivers are still seeing savings as these oil prices have tumbled. $689 with an EV is about what you would pay if you were driving 30 miles a day, compared to almost $1,000 with a gas-powered vehicle. And that's with the crazy low oil prices that we're seeing. So we're still seeing savings, and also those prices are almost guaranteed to be regular over a longer course of time. And that kind of fluctuation is very risky if you are a consumer and you're budget conscious as well. But if you don't have the ability to charge at home, there are other options that will make charging an electric vehicle possible for you. And that's public level 2 charging. And so as an example, I'm a renter and I can't install a level 2 charging unit at home. So I rely on a mix of level 1 charging. So I get that 4 miles of range per hour. And then public charging when it's convenient and available. So someone else who has charging installed at their workplace, for example, might forego installing a level 2 charging station at home to rely mostly on their station at work or public stations in general. So I encourage you, if you're thinking about switching to an EV or if you already drive one, just thinking about where you drive regularly and where you might be able to charge. And you'd probably be surprised by the prevalence of charging stations in New England. And PlugShare is a great resource to see what is near you. And PlugShare is a website where you can look at charging stations of all different kinds of networks and see what is near you and use it that way. And this is moving along quite quickly because of utility engagement. So both Eversource and National Grid have programs to help businesses and multi-unit dwellings, like apartment buildings or condos, to afford to install public charging. And there's a good chunk of the Volkswagen settlement money that's being used on installing charging station as well. So they are popping up all over the place, but it's not something that you would really notice unless you own an electric car and you're checking out these apps regularly, because that's how drivers find these stations. So if you don't see them, it's very possible that there are more that you think hidden from view. And again, so there are multiple public charging networks, different brands that have different apps. and they're not as well advertised as the huge signage that we're accustomed to with gas stations. Public charging stations are usually tucked into parking lots and spaces where people will be stopped for a few hours. And so there are a couple of the most popular charging networks that are out there today. And each of them have different payment plans depending on the type of station that you're using. Pretty much all of them rely on smartphone apps so that you can monitor your charging, estimate your costs, and get notifications when your charging is done so that you can go ahead and move your car. But it is hard to give an estimate as to how much public charging costs because, you know, even within specific networks, it really varies by the station. So some charge by the number of kilowatt hours that go into your car. Others charge by the time that you spend parked there, kind of like a normal parking space. And a lot of times charging is free. So it really varies and it's hard to give an exact estimate as to how much it'll cost. But almost every charging station that I've ever used in the Boston and Providence areas, which is where I spend most of my time, have been free, and I've only ever had to pay for parking in order to use the station. And I will say ChargePoint has the biggest network in the Northeast by far. So it's worth having a membership for the convenience for it. And, you know, as you're traveling or on the go or, you know, noticing what stations are around you, you might install a different network as you need. And I also want to mention there are a lot of non-networked stations, meaning that there's no smartphone app for them. So with those, you kind of just have to show up and see if you can plug in. But PlugShare, which I shared on the previous slide, does a really good job of finding stations in any network. So you can find all of those. So as an example of how you would use that software, let's pretend for just a moment that the stay-at-home orders have ended, the parks have reopened, and I've decided to take a trip to the Roger Williams Park Zoo in Providence. While I was planning my trip, I might take a look at the charging map to see if there was any charging close by. And there is a station right in the park that you can see when you look at the PlugShare map. So with that first app, you can see what kind of plug is available, how many stations there are, when it's open, what else is around, if someone else is plugged in already. There's a lot of information there. And then you can also see in that initial PlugShare search that the station is a ChargePoint station. So at that point, you might switch to that app and then see that it's a 6.6 kilowatt station that you can use for free. So if I was spending 3 hours at the zoo and driving a fully electric car, that would be about 60 driving miles that are free and that I don't have to pay for. So in this case, even though, you know, I'm not necessarily going to be relying on the charger at the Roger Williams Park Zoo for most of my charging, it's handy to know that these tools exist and that they can seriously decrease the cost of charging an electric car. So next, I'll be talking a little bit about fast charging, but let me take a break for questions. Looks like some people are interested in the batteries webinar. I will definitely send along that information after this webinar. So someone asked, if it costs about half as much to drive an electric vehicle, why is the annual fuel cost for an EV $689 and not more like half of $955? That's a great question. So it really depends on the numbers that you use for the cost of gasoline. I did that math really quick right before the webinar started to reflect the fact that in many places, gas is about $2 a gallon. In many places, it's higher than that, especially if you live in the Boston area or in urban areas in general. And so those numbers can fluctuate a little bit based off of, what the precise number of miles that you're driving is and what the cost of gasoline is. But those are fair estimates, and they may fluctuate. And I encourage you, I can, after this webinar as well, I can share the math the green energy consumers had done at the end of 2019 in order for you to plug in your own numbers and see what that number might be for you. But again, because gas prices are so low, you won't see quite the amount of savings that we've talked about in the past, but you still see a fair chunk of change. Someone's asking, are some network operators preferred, or are there better companies to work with? That's a great question. So I think that for level 2 charging, I've seen, based off of my own experience and talking to other EV drivers, there's a fair amount of consistency in the reliability of all the level 2 chargers that we've used. Where it starts to get a little bit more difficult is level 3 charging, which I'll be talking about next, where with the faster charging, rates tend to be more expensive, and the actual performance of those super high power stations can vary depending on that particular piece of hardware. But across level 2 stations, I would say that they're all pretty good, and it's just a matter of personal preference and what is available near you. So definitely, if there's a station or type of network that works better for you because there are more around, that's the one you should go with. ChargePoint just happens to have a very, very large presence in the Northeast area. Someone's asking, how many years is the lifespan of EV batteries? Yeah, so again, that can really vary depending on how old the vehicle is. The original Nissan Leaf that came out in 2012 is not doing as great as Nissan Leafs that came out in 2016 or 2017. But we have seen that, especially with cars that are 2016 and beyond, batteries are lasting a really long time. The rule of thumb is that a battery will last as long as the life of the vehicle. And there are warranties to protect consumers in case there is a mechanical issue that is atypical. But in general, you can expect the battery to last the full life of the car, and you won't ever have to replace it. And if you do, it'll be covered under warranty and you won't have to pay for it. Lots of good questions here. Someone's asking what the lifespan is of the level 2 charging stations, and have they been around long enough for us to know? That's a good question. So I haven't seen that talked about very much, but I think I've read the hardware lasts for about 15 years, and then at one point you might have to replace it. But in general, these charging stations are pretty robust. And the major thing that a lot of installers are thinking about is not, is the charging station going to be okay, but are there going to be additional upgrades to electrical infrastructure that will be required in order to support a higher number of charging stations? So it's really kind of like the transmission and distribution infrastructure that will need some work from the utilities and not necessarily the charging station hardware itself. But that's a great question. I do see a few more questions, but I'll just answer one and then move on. And hopefully I'll have time to answer some more at the end. Someone's asking, are there battery warranties when you buy a pre-owned EV? The answer is yes. So battery warranties will transfer to the new owner of the vehicle. And those usually last, I believe I said 8 years or 100,000 miles. So if you're buying pre-owned, as long as you're within that warranty period, you should be covered, but it really depends on the vehicle model and year. So be sure to check that before you commit to purchasing a pre-owned vehicle. Okay, thank you everyone for all the great questions. I do see one about fast charging, and hopefully I'll be able to answer it in this next section. Because for the most part, level 1 and level 2 charging are good for daily driving. But most people, when they're thinking about the driving range of a vehicle, are concerned about the occasional very long drives that they have to make. And they're going to plan to buy a car that will support them on that journey. So for example, let's say you're driving from Boston to Philadelphia, and that's a little over 300 miles and just out of the range of the 250 miles that most all-electric vehicles have right now. So there does need to be a charging speed that accommodates that. And we see that in DC fast charging. So how it works is it allows EVs to charge much faster, despite the limitations of the car's onboard charger. So again, the onboard charger is that device that's converting power from AC to DC format. But if the power of the charging station that's flowing through the wires is already in DC format, then you can bypass that onboard charger and allow energy to flow directly into the battery. So that means it's possible to deliver much more power and therefore charge much faster without worrying about the limitations of level 2. And so unlike level 1 and level 2 charging, there are some specialized ports specifically for DC fast charging among electric vehicles. And there are 3 of those. There's the J1772 combo, the CHAdeMO, which you see in the middle there, and then Tesla's proprietary port that they use for everything. Notice the J1772 combo is the same as the J177 top. So you see that same shape, but then there's a little extra piece at the bottom, and those 2 little pins are required for fast charging. The CHAdeMO port is an entirely different port in the car, and that's mostly used by Asian automakers. So you'll have in a Nissan Leaf, for example, a J1772 port, and then right next to it, a CHAdeMO port. So depending on which charging speed you're using, you would plug it into a different port. And then finally, Tesla just uses the one port for everything. And so if you're owning an electric vehicle, you don't really have to be super well versed on all the different port types. You really just need to know what kind of port your car has. And then all the cool charging station locator apps that I was talking about earlier will only show you what's compatible with your car. So you won't have to worry about getting to a charging station and realizing, oh, this is only CHAdeMO, but I have a J1772 port. You can see that information all on the app. And it's also important to note, if you have not yet purchased an electric vehicle, not all vehicles have DC fast charging capability. It's becoming more of a standard option because automakers are realizing that it comes in handy and it's a good thing to have in the car. But especially with older cars, say around 2017 or 2018, it's funny that I just referred to those as older cars, but I guess that's a testament to how quickly electric vehicle technology is moving. But the point is, cars that are just a little bit older may not have the DC fast charging port standard. So if you do want this capability, it's important to confirm that it's something that your car has so that you can actually plug the port in. And I do recommend it. It's something that comes in handy, even if you don't do a lot of long distance driving. So how much faster is fast charging? Most stations are 25 kilowatts, and that's what is available now. But many EVs have an either 500 kilowatt or 100 kilowatt max charging speed for DC fast charging. So for example, the Bolt has a 50 kilowatt cap. So the figure you'll see advertised is it takes about 30 minutes to go 90 miles. The Nissan Leaf Plus has a max charging rate of 100 kilowatts. So you do have a potential for faster charging there if you have a faster charging station. And so like the maximum speed for level 2 charging, there is a limit that a vehicle can reach. And that's because the charging speed is managed by the battery's management system, which is the software that keeps the battery at the right temperature. But we see new electric cars kind of pushing this limit all the time. So even though we've seen level 2 charging kind of normalize out at about 25 miles of range per hour, all the new electric cars keep pushing the boundary of how fast they can fast charge. So it's really meant to try and help support drivers on those longer road trips where, you know, the shorter you can stop, you know, as you're making your way along a journey, the better it'll be. But I do want to emphasize DC fast charging is very high voltage and introduces a lot of heat into the battery. And it's not a good thing to do for most of your charging. You really want to be sticking with either level 1 or level 2 for the majority of your miles. And that's because not only is it unnecessary, you know, most cars spend about 95% of their time parked. So that is plenty of time to recharge for most people. But overusing DC fast charging can actually affect the long-term storage capacity of the battery. So you really only want to do it in those instances where you're driving long distances and you have no other choice. And for that same reason, we'll see that DC fast charging is only really very fast, up to 80%. And beyond that, it slows down significantly to avoid battery damage. So in the graph we see here, this is a model mock-up of what the charging profile for the BMW i3 looks like. And you can see that charging speed starts to drop off at about 60% or 80%, depending on which model you were using. And that's because, you know, charging really quickly at those higher state of charges just is not very good for the battery. So it's a great option for travelers, but an emergency one. So how is the DC fast charging network being built out? We can see on the screen there a map of the DC fast charging stations in New England. And the more of those that there are, the faster or the easier it'll be to support long distance drives. Installing these stations is quite expensive. And so the priority for many of the DC fast charging companies has been to put them along highways and interstates in order to support corridors where there are a lot of traffic. So there are a bunch of EV fast chargers installed along the Mass Pike, along I-95 and other major corridors in the Northeast. And this is great and important because these long distance trips are, you know, kind of like the final thing that most people are worried about when they're considering buying an electric car. So it's great to be able to support the infrastructure. But you know, there's also an issue with the fact that DC fast charging is much more expensive than level 1 or level 2 charging. So you're not just paying for the electricity that you're using. In many cases, with the fast charging networks, you're paying a premium because it's like a service, right? You're using a lot of electricity very quickly in order to travel. And so we do see billing much higher. Just to answer one of the questions that was asked. Usually the billing is either by minute or by amount of energy delivered. But you do pay a premium for that. And those are usually billed to a prepaid credit card. So you'd have to open an account and charge that way. The two big networks for DC fast charging are Electrify America and EVgo. And if you are interested in learning more about this, we had one of our EV ambassadors for the Drive Green program take a very long distance road trip in which he and his wife did a lot of DC fast charging and had a lot of experience with these fast charging networks. There are lots of people who they've owned an EV for years and have never touched one of these DC fast chargers. So the level of experience can really vary. As a final note before I answer some of our last questions here, because it is getting close to 1 o'clock, I just want to say that charging is very different from gasoline, and part of making the switch to an electric car is just changing on your perspective on what's convenient. We're used to refueling with gas cars, but electric cars have their own benefits. So if you're driving about 40 miles a day, then you have to refuel a gasoline-powered car once every 10 days. And so it takes time to take a detour to the gas station. It takes about 5 or 10 minutes to fill up. And it's like an excess trip that you have to make. With a battery electric vehicle, if you're getting about 250 miles on a full charge, when you're charging at home, then you basically just step out of your car, you unroll your charging cable and you plug it in right there. It takes very little time, and instead of waiting until you're nearly empty, charging is something that is convenient and easy enough for you to do very often, and just plugging in when you're a little low. So 20 or 30% capacity, it would be a great time to plug in your car. It's not really a major change in lifestyle, but it is a change in mindset, right? So I just want to put that out there, because I think, the paradigm is really different, and we have a lot of people who are nervous about making that switch. So that is the end of my presentation. I hope that you enjoyed it and learned something new. And since we do have just a couple more minutes, I'd love to answer any final questions that were coming out there. So one person is asking, I'm thinking about getting a Hyundai Kona. Should I do it now or wait a few more years? So that's a great question. I want to be clear in saying that, because electric vehicles are improving so quickly, I anticipate that in 5 years, most people will be thinking about getting an electric car when they're considering their next car purchase. However, I think that there's a lot of value in switching now, especially if you're already planning on getting a new car and would like to do something that decreases your greenhouse gas emissions in the immediate future. Primarily, electric cars are still pretty rare. And so again, in my experience, I love being able to charge up for free. I love the ease of finding charging stations that are available all over Boston and Providence. I've found that since I switched, I've really enjoyed talking about my car to other people. And it's been a great switch for me. Everyone that I know that I've talked to through the Drive Green program has enjoyed their switch to an electric vehicle. And so there is a case to be made for doing it now. I think if you can make it work, if you can afford it, then it's a great time to go electric. If you're still kind of on the fence, if a new electric vehicle is still slightly out of your price point for you, then it's worth waiting. But for the most part, there's a lot of good reasons to make the switch as soon as possible. So one person is commenting on an issue that they've noticed with charging stations, which is the location is not a place that you would want to spend an extended amount of time, and how will the networks improve this aspect? Yeah, so that's a great question. I think charging networks are trying really hard to put charging stations in places that people will use them and appreciate them. I think the big factor is, getting landowners on board. So it is an investment to install a charging station on your property, more so than if you're installing a charging station at home, just because usually parking lots don't have access to electricity in the same way that garages do. And so I think a lot of businesses are making the switch and trying to provide that service for people that visit them. And we are seeing utility support from National Grid and Eversource. So they're actually running programs to help decrease the upfront cost of installing those charging stations in order to make it less of a barrier for businesses and shopping centers and places like that to install charging. And I also know that that Mass Audubon has done some great work in making it a priority to install charging stations at many of their wildlife sanctuaries to show their commitment to electrification. And so our hope is that more and more organizations will kind of get the message and be able to offer that service to people who need it and want it. So I guess the answer there is time. So someone's asking if the 250-mile range associated with electric cars is normal for use of things like the radio, the heater, the air conditioner, things like that. Yeah, so in addition to having a big lithium-ion battery in order to power the electric powertrain for an electric car, there is a 12-volt battery that handles things like the radio, and the electronics in the car. So that is the same as a gas-powered car. You have that additional power source. If you're blasting the heat, which is a really energy-intensive appliance, you might see a decrease in range. But in general, 250 miles, depending on what the car is a pretty good estimate. You always want to make sure to check the EPA estimated range in order to see what you should expect for your vehicle. But that is a year-round average, and so it takes into account both the warm weather months and the cold weather months. I mentioned earlier in the cold, EVs tend to get less driving range, and that's because some energy from the battery is required to heat the battery so that it is staying at the optimal temperature. And also to heat the cabin in order to keep the people inside of the car warm. So the biggest drop in range that you'll see is in the winter time. But again, that means in the summer, you can expect to get much more than what the estimated range is. And of course, one thing that I've noticed is in my EV, when I'm driving at really fast speeds, let's say I'm going 70 or 75 on the highway, I'll see a much faster drop in range just because electric cars are more efficient at city speeds than at highway speeds. But the cars are pretty good at taking a look at what your driving history is and then adjusting the range predictor based off of that history. So as soon as you drive your car a little bit, you will get used to the number and kind of understand what that means depending on the type of driving that you're doing. But that's a great question. So I do see a couple more questions that are about kind of more personal specific situations. So I'll reach out to folks who ask questions like that in order to get you an answer. But those are all the questions that I see here. So thank you again for joining me in this webinar. I had a lot of time, I had a lot of fun talking about charging. And if you do think of additional questions or have specific comments or just need some time for all this information to settle in before you think of a question, feel free to just jot my email down and send me an email with your question at some point in the future. And I'll also be sure to send along the resources that people had asked about regarding the upcoming webinars or the past webinars that we've done about batteries, and also some of the resources that we have at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. So thanks again for joining me, and have a good rest of your day.